In this comparative study, I have chosen to compare the 1967 film The Graduate, directed by Mike Nichols, and the 1960 film Breathless, directed by Jean-Luc Godard. My film focus is the French New Wave, and the topic I will be discussing is the French New Wave's effect on the film styles and plot elements of my task components. The book, A History of French New Wave Cinema by Richard Newport, gives a good definition of the French New Wave, stating that the New Wave taught an entire generation to experiment with the rules of storytelling, but also to rethink conventional film budgets and production norms. Despite Breathless and The Graduate appearing starkly different at first glance, they both heavily are inspired by French New Wave cinema. To understand what makes these two films similar, we first need to explore the cultural context of these two films. The Graduate is an American film that was released in 1967, whereas Breathless is a French film released in 1960. Though they both stem from a similar time historically, they represent two very different socioeconomic and geographical backgrounds. The Graduate takes place in a wealthy upper-middle-class family in California and criticizes the middle class for its superficial and materialistic ideals. Although never explicitly referenced in the film, it was produced in the midst of the Vietnam War and captures the political and social change from the growing dissatisfaction with the status quo. It mirrors the anarchic mode that society entered during this time, according to Frank Rick of the Criterion Collection.
Yes, sir.
The film challenges the self-imposed censorship of Hollywood through its unconventional storytelling, states Alan Scott of the Smithsonian Magazine. It features a hero that lacks purpose and speaks with radical skepticism of American dollars, ambitions, and visions, which was contrary to most films of its era. Breathless, on the other hand, takes place in Paris, France, and focuses on the simple lives of two lower-middle-class characters. Its depiction of the simple and mundane are also reflective of the socio-economic context of France at the time of the film's release. The French and Francophone Guide presented by the Library of Congress describes post-World War II France as it was shifting its attitudes away from the fixed social structures, political orders, and financial systems of pre-war France. It was turning into a more modern and theoretical approach to society and its rules. The new generation was characterized by social upheaval and the search for individuality. This is reflected in Breathless as it bends the mold of cinematic structure and presents something fresh and unique. Breathless looks at the seemingly ordinary relationship between Michelle and Patricia following their fractured comments on life. It skims over a more violent and serious nature of the film by presenting it in a quick and simple way, often set in mundane places. This reflects a lot of society's attitudes about World War II at the time. Society would focus on their own simple tasks, trying to find purpose and clarity on why they are living, distracting themselves from the violence and the pain of the past. It is also significant to this study that we examine the events that led up to the French New Wave, such as the devastation that France was met with after the war that constrained directors to low-budget films, as for many filmmakers, expensive equipment was not an option. This led to more emphasis on natural lighting, on-location shooting, and experimental editing. These were all contributors to the documentary feel of the French New Wave cinema, which aimed at capturing the lives of everyday people. Newport explains that they used their own production money or found unconventional producers to make low-budget films set within the milieus they knew best, contemporary France of contemporary middle-class youths. These were all hallmarks of French New Wave cinema and something that both Godard and Nichols represent in their films, despite depicting two very different images of society. First, I would like to focus on the unconventional and experimental camera techniques often associated with the French New Wave, and how both The Graduate and Breathless demonstrated these. Nichols' camera technique veers from what is anticipated, which lends to such an interesting and surprising look at the life of a young bachelor in The Graduate. This is very typical of French New Wave film, constantly diverging from the conventional film techniques of the time. Rather than viewing Ben as the stereotypical rich bachelor who has endless possibilities, we see a young boy who is beset with loneliness. Nichols, through this film, expresses that even when it seems like someone is living the best of all possible lives, they can still be unsatisfied. These sentiments can be seen through the very first frame of the film, as the audience is able to understand Ben's loneliness and anxiety through this slow push-out of the camera. The attention is first drawn to Ben's solemn and indifferent expression, and then it is revealed that he is surrounded by a crowd of people. Even with all these people, he is left unimpressed and alone. This loneliness and anxiety are further emphasized by Nichols through the motif of water, according to Shannon McGulch of the Penn State University Press, which Ben is constantly being surrounded by at the beginning of the film. The water represents these ideals that his parents and society are surrounding him by. He feels trapped by these conventions, and they only make him feel more isolated from society.
However, when Ben starts his affair with Mrs. Robinson, he is depicted floating atop the family pool to illustrate him taking some control over his life. The placement of Ben in this shot compared to previously in the film visually alerts the audience of Ben's newfound freedom. The camera continues to subvert expectations as Nichols chooses to shoot handheld to depict Ben being congratulated by a long line of adults. The camera tightly fixed on Ben creates a much more personal look into how he must be feeling at this moment. The result is claustrophobic, placing the audience in the same uneasy state of mind as Ben. These are just a handful of moments in The Graduate where camera movement subverts expectation and provides a look into the personal lives of the characters, rather than a grander situation at hand, a common attribute of French New Wave films, where the small details of the characters' lives are highlighted over the larger story around them. A similar technique is demonstrated by Godard as he utilizes unique camera movement strategies that were quite revolutionary and unprecedented. His impulsive, handheld camera work challenges the previous conventions of pre-French New Wave cinema. In Breathless, the camera came down to the real world and began to observe the lives of the people from a close distance, states Vitamin Chen. Similar to Nichols, Godard highlights the lives of the individual over the larger situation in society. Another new camera technique Godard experimented with was the follow shot. This shot enhanced his director's sensibility as he was able to focus on one particular character, emphasizing how they felt in this scene. In this scene, when Michelle is running from the police, the follow shot allows the audience to feel the suspense and anxiety he's experiencing in the moment much better than any stationary wide shot could. These unconventional camera techniques that differed from what was anticipated by the audience create a more realistic view of the lives of the characters, which is key in French New Wave cinema. The Graduate demonstrates many of these same strategies as Breathless, a renowned French New Wave film. Therefore, it is logical to assume that both took inspiration from the movement. I would next like to focus on the editing styles displayed in the two films in relation to the French New Wave editing styles. Unlike all classical Hollywood films, French New Wave films tend to break the rules of continuity editing and use a free style of editing. The directors of French New Wave often drew attention from audiences with discontinuity, reminding them that they're watching a movie, according to Stephen Nottingham. In Breathless, Godard masterfully uses the jump cut to highlight the urban rhythm of Paris and the whirlwind pace of modern romance. In an article published by the University of Pittsburgh, it states, on one hand, Godard seems to place little emphasis on anything, and yet, at the same time, some of Breathless languishes in its patience. He uses jump cuts to condense time, and to make the drama seem to move more quickly than it does. In The Graduate, we see various types of cuts displayed that are all aimed at evoking a different sense within the audience. It is something quite contrary to typical New Wave cinema that would employ simple methods of editing. The Graduate experimented with various editing strategies, like in this montage of Ben after his affair with Miss Robinson. Pablo Hernandez explains that during this montage we see the screen dissolve multiple times, close and at bird's eye view of Ben catching some sun in his pool. With the film's main song Sound of Silence, this montage shows how unhappy and confused Ben was with his life. This edit emphasizes Ben's constant state of discontent, regardless of his situation. This stress on the personal feelings of the characters is a typical feature of French New Wave cinema. Referring to when Ben first took Miss Robinson to her home, there was a long cut. A long cut is when the scene is drawn out longer than it's supposed to be, signaling the discomfort that Ben felt as he was being asked to stay longer than he wanted to with Miss Robinson. So although The Graduate does not present typical disjointed cuts that were common with French New Wave cinema, it still has a particularly interesting and unconventional editing style that worked to challenge the norms of American filmmaking. Another key point of French New Wave filmmaking was the shared themes and narratives. New Wave stories tended to be loosely organized around rather complex, spontaneous young characters. Importantly, unpolished, sometimes disjointed film styles fit these rather chaotic, good-humored tales of youths wandering around contemporary France, according to Robert Newport. Breathless follows a few characters that, despite their situation, live very simple lives. The characters discuss their faults in life and how it should be lived, and in the film, she was focusing on the small problems in life while ignoring the very big problems. They shot this in a very simple way, as if it were just a quick romance, when in actuality it's more serious and violent. It follows characters thinking about what they want in their lives, trying to add a little more clarity and purpose to what they're doing. What's truly interesting about this movie is the way in which it presents itself. Breathless is a culmination of a series of simple pieces of dialogue. It's a film about crime, murder, and theft, but the film never addresses any of that in detail. Instead, it spends most of its time in mundane places like small apartments and in cars. This is a hallmark of French New Wave cinema, according to the California Film Institute, the use of common and accessible settings like apartments and streets to create a real-to-life feel in the movies. The French New Wave marked many revolutionary techniques as well as a shift in attitudes towards the lives and feelings of people rather than the larger plot. Breathless, being a notable film of the French New Wave, makes it a great point of reference for comparison of The Graduate and the influence of French New Wave cinema had on it. I believe the influence of French New Wave cinema on The Graduate is undeniable. Despite Nichols paving the way for some new film techniques of his own, much of what is displayed in The Graduate is also seen in French New Wave cinema.